So hello, thank you for joining us today for MDI Science Cafe. I'm Fred Bever. I'm the Chief of Communications at the MDI Biological Laboratory. You're joined today by many folk from our development departments, as well as our guests, Andrew Revkin of Columbia and Elisabeth Marnik of the Husson University, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a couple of minutes. I really want to welcome you and thank you for joining this forum today on fighting trolls and finding allies. Scientists need social media. It's a fraught world and an important and useful world as well. And so we have this great opportunity to explore it with our guests who are both involved in both worlds. You may know the MDI Biological Laboratory is an independent nonprofit biomedical research institution. We're in Bar Harbor, founded 125 years ago this year. We work with animal models and biotechnology tools to explore human physiology and a lot of interesting work around aging and regeneration is really our focus these days. We also do a lot of trainings in biomedical science for the general public and particularly for young scientists to help them develop their interest in their tools for doing good science. Andrew Revkin he's a deeply experienced author. He's a science environmental journalist. Back in the 90s, he helped to pioneer and shape the climate coverage at the New York Times. He created the groundbreaking, early blog called .Earth. He's worked with numerous science communications enterprises, National Geographic, Science, Discover Magazine. He's worked for ProPublica for a while. And he founded Columbia University's Initiative on Communication and Sustainability, which is his main gig now, I think. His side gig has always been music. I'm very envious that he played with Pete Seeger a lot, and I think they were friends and collaborators. Andy, you can find Andy a lot on Twitter as @Revkin, and also his Sustain What Substack newsletter. Elisabeth Marnik, she is an educator at Husson University. She also teaches biomedical bootcamp courses with us at the MDI campus. She received her doctorate in immunology and genetics at Tufts, did her postdoctoral work here at the lab. Among her accomplishments while working at the lab, she discovered a new gene in C. elegans roundworms. It's a model for human gene that's important to the perpetuation of germ cell lines. She called it LOTR1, and I think that Lord of the Rings fans can try to figure that one out. So with that, I just want to launch right away. And Liz, why don't we start with you? I guess I should say a couple of things to the guests. We'd like you to participate. If you'd stay muted until we call on you, or until you got to say something, that would be great. So there's not a lot of interference, and we just want to keep it civil. And you could write some questions we have in the Q&A section that we have, if you want to sort of give us a heads up on what your question's about or what you're interested in. This is something new to us, to try to make use of the Q&A. So give it a whirl if you feel like it. Liz, why don't you tell us a little bit about your involvement with social media? Why are you involved with social media?
Yeah, so my social media science communication, I would say started accidentally. It started at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was seeing lots and lots of misinformation on my local Facebook pages from friends and family. And I did feel a responsibility to try to address some of that misinformation since I have the science background to do that. So I started doing a lot of that on my personal Facebook page. And then those posts started to be shared outside of my friends and family network. So then I started to decide that I probably should be doing this on a platform that was separate from my personal Facebook page. So I ended up starting an Instagram account, which is Science with Liz, and then there's also a Facebook page attached to that. And it kind of just started with mostly just friends and local family following me, but now I have about 30,000 followers, which is kind of crazy for me to think about.
Some of us might be envious, but maybe not Andy Revkin. Andy, I think you have like 100,000 followers, is that right? On your
Well,
Twitter feed?
on Twitter, 90 or 90, on Facebook, 90,000. Although I'm in Instagram now, I'm like, there's still like 2,000. There are, each one of these platforms has a different flavor to it too. You know, LinkedIn, which more professional folks would be more familiar with. I don't know why my camera keeps turning off. I'm still here. Speaking of technology, I'm gonna switch cameras. Hold on. Let's try. Whoops. Hold on. I'm still here. Yeah, there you can watch come up my nose now. I just switched technology. Yeah. I was just saying LinkedIn, you know, is mostly sort of resume trading, although there's a lot of interesting activity there. And on all these platforms, you can find groups. So it's, you know, it's a different flavor everywhere and different audience. And I've had different impacts on different parts of it.
So I'm curious from each of you, just jump in. I mean, is this like the place for communicating science to the general public now? Or for reacting to communications about science? Is this completely replaced other forums?
Well, if I could, let me just sort of complete my little learning journey because it would help. You know,
Sure.
I was a magazine writer for a bunch of years in the early 80s when we still read things like this. This is my cover story on global warming in 1988. So back then you wrote a story, it was paid for, in this case, with cigarette advertising, which is really weird. You know, we're selling global warming concern cigarettes at the same time. And there would be a letter to the editor, maybe 5 or 6, and there you're done. Then I went to the New York Times, 1995, 96, 14 years in the newsroom, where there was a rhythm. You reported and wrote a story and it got posted and you were done. And there might be a letter to the editor or 2 or 3. In 2003, I went to the North Pole for the New York Times. And I thought, you know, I'm going there without a photographer. I better damn well bring a camera. I better damn well bring a video camera. I better bring any possible thing I can bring with me to help convey what it's like to do science at the North Pole. And it was a good thing I did because it was amazing. It's an amazing story. I could have done my job. My job would have been to take a notes in a pad, send my story, you know, via the internet, via satellite phone, and I could have slept, but I just didn't feel I would be a responsible journalist. So I became a videographer. I became a photographer. Well, I was already a photographer. I started thinking about sound. The North Pole is full of weird sounds. 2005, I went to the Greenland ice sheet, and I went to the Montreal climate talks, these climate treaty talks. I had a recorder, you know, we record interviews. And in Montreal, I said I was brainstorming with an editor and we did a podcast. That was 2005. That's, you know, podcasts now are everywhere. But I felt I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't capturing the sound. And it's a good thing I did because there were kids there protesting in these hallways, which are mostly full of people in suits. And these young people were today's Greta Thunberg. You didn't hear about them because they didn't have Twitter. But I wrote and I podcasted on the New York Times website. And when I went to Greenland, same thing. I started doing a sort of daily blog. And that led me to really focus as a journalist on the importance of having a dynamic relationship with audiences, not just sort of job done, go home. And it led me to a whole new arenas to report on. I think it built my credibility with audiences that might normally be resistant to science. It just did all of that. And then Twitter came around in 2007. I immediately signed up. And from then forward, I was always looking at these tools, and I started writing about them more because, just one last thing, the communication climate, which right now feels pretty polluted, is vital to explore and deal with if you really want to have impact on the actual climate or the actual biosphere. It's a part of the Earth system now, how we communicate. So it's just like all one big thing. And of course, it's polluted. As I said, I'm sure we'll talk about that. That's not just trolls. There's all kinds of stuff.
Liz, for you, is it part of doing science? Is it part of the reason you do science is to communicate? And is that, you I mean, I suspect you're a little younger than Andy, and so you may have come of age in a more mature social media environment. What is your social media activity about? Why do you do it?
Yeah, I still do remember dial-up
Insights.
internet. I am old enough for remembering the days of dial-up internet and having to, my mom would have to kick me off the internet because I was making it so she couldn't make any phone calls. But yeah, I think my generation is a little different because we have really come of age in this social media generation. And I do feel a responsibility as a scientist to communicate science to the general public. And I know not everyone can do that for a variety of reasons, whether it be time or ability or whatever. But I do feel that responsibility, especially since we are seeing science becoming more polarized. And I do blame social media for a lot of that because we now live in echo chambers of people can start this rumor and then it gets passed on millions and millions of times, and it's hard to counteract that. So as a scientist, I do feel a responsibility to try to get information into the hands of the general public. And I think it's important for a few reasons. One is that they deserve to have access to information that is accurate, especially when it impacts their health or their livelihood or climate change, which will impact all of us. But also because it's going to benefit us as scientists. If people understand the importance of science, then they're going to be more willing to fund the science and support the science when we need that science supported. Oh, Fred, you're muted. Oh, still muted. It wouldn't be a Zoom if we didn't have to say that at least once or twice.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Well, which brings me to platforms. That's being one. Liz, you post mainly on Instagram, although you're on Twitter. Andy, you post mainly on Twitter. You both use Substack. What goes into your choice of which media you use? Is it really just a matter of how your comfort level has evolved, or are there particular audiences that you either are attracted to or want to monitor or particularly want to communicate with?
Well, as Elisabeth just said, you also have to do time management. And one thing I think is really important in all of this, in communicating, period, whether you're a scientist, journalist, or concerned citizen, is to choose a form and format and community you feel comfortable in. Twitter, I use reportorially continually. It's invaluable, despite everything Elon Musk has done to it, which has mainly created chaos. And I use it as a search engine, not just as a place to say, hey, look what I just did. I use it to find experts. When they had the earthquake, and I already had done reporting in Turkey on earthquake risk, but to get a hold of people on the ground without going there, I used Twitter and Facebook. When the Nepal earthquake in 2000, I can't keep them all straight. 2015, I think. Anyway, I wrote a story about how people were using Facebook there to say, hey, our village is cut off. We need a helicopter here. So this isn't just scientists and communicators. It's everybody facing some stress. And so you kind of fish around and look, some people are good at video. Some people have great, enthusiasm for, or basically if you've been on Facebook for a long time, you can create a group about something you really care about. Sea level rise in Maine, we live on a coastal area. I'm trying to figure out how to sustain our little marsh, building outward. And then as a scientist, engaging in those communities, depending on your skills, can make Facebook very useful too. So it's like a comfort thing. Don't try to do it all. I still experiment on TikTok and Instagram, but I don't spend a lot of time there because it would take me so long to get up to speed. And I hope people stay with Twitter. It's until it literally stops working, because there's a ton of ways to use it without being abused by it. I wrote one of my Substack columns is about how to use Twitter without being abused by it. And it's incredibly useful.
It's really useful for hunting for new employees, refining people's research to being alerted to new research. Aside from getting into trying to truth tell, what do you, Liz, what do you use it for? And setting aside your personal lives, but just from a professional point of view.
Yeah, I think social media definitely is helpful in building connections. So at the start of the pandemic, I was in an academic moms group, and we were talking a lot about, being in academia while juggling children at home with you while you were trying to work full time during the lockdowns. And from that, I actually met one of my really closest friends in science communication. I collaborate with her on a lot of posts. She runs the account called Unambiguous Science. And then we both started our social media science communication efforts. And then from there, we started to meet more and more people. So now we have a whole network of primarily mothers. And I say that because I feel like we also, mothers are particularly at risk for misinformation. So I feel like those of us who are mothers ourselves and scientists ourselves can reach that audience maybe a little bit more than others can. But we have a whole network now of those of us who are working in doing science communication in different platforms and in different ways. But when we have somebody come after us, a troll or somebody, some of my friends have gotten doxxed. I thankfully, knock on wood, have not. We all can mass report that account together. We can commiserate. We can vent about all of that information. So it's really built really good connections. Also, it's helped us reach people, but it's also really helped me make friends that I now feel like I'll have for a lifetime.
One thing we're going to do is try to occasionally explain terms in the chat section, such as doxed. Maybe Liz, you can just quickly say what that means.
Yeah, so when somebody's doxxed, it means that their address and contact information and place of employment is put out publicly on the internet. And typically the motivation behind that is to cause issues. So either threaten that person physically if you're in the location or send them threatening letters at their house. It can be a pretty scary situation when it happens.
So let me ask you, I want to ask both of you, like best experiences, worst experiences. What was that your worst experience, or what was your worst experience trying to tell science online? And how did it go? What was it about? Liz, starting with you.
Okay. So I think I luckily have not been doxxed. Very early on when I started to do this, I actually pay for a service to like remove my address from the internet. And for me, it was really worth it to have that kind of, clearly people could still figure out where I work. It's not that hard. But I wanted to make it at least a little bit harder for people to find my contact information. So I did that kind of as a preemptive prophylactic step. But I do, because I post about vaccinations and I'm very vocal about the fact that I believe vaccines are life-saving and are important. And I talked about how my son was in the Pfizer vaccine trial for COVID-19. I have gotten lots and lots of comments from people who say that my children should be taken away from me, that I am abusive to my children because I vaccinate them. And I would say those are probably the hardest types of comments that I get. So, and I think that's kind of true for a lot of us who share this information about vaccines particularly. It tends to bring out the worst in people when you're talking about it in regards to children. So they definitely have gone after me and my family in that sense, saying that I'm hurting my kids by doing this.
Wow. Yeah, I'm showing, I think, can you see my screen?
Yes.
I'm showing, this is 2009, and it was not involving social media directly, but Rush Limbaugh, when he was still alive, had heard indirectly through a blog post about something I said about population in the context of climate, and this is what he said.
This guy from the New York Times, if he really thinks that humanity is destroying the planet, humanity is destroying the climate, that human beings in their natural existence are going to cause the extinction of life on Earth. Andrew Revkin. Mr. Revkin, why don't you just go kill yourself and help the planet by dying?
Yeah, so that was interesting. Let me, whoops, why is that still going? Hold on. Yeah. Let me shut it down. There we go. Yeah. So, some of this talk radio had all these characteristics as well, even before this era. Although, and I started getting phone calls and stuff. It's particularly worse for women. It's worse for people of color. It's worse for women of, anyone with a difference. The numbers show this is a significant problem online. The terrible thing about these platforms is they're not designed to find the best of us. They literally are programmed to take you to the worst of yourself. And people who are vulnerable or agitated or the like are prime fodder. This has come out over and over again. So hot button issues. One of the worst is again the vaccine issue. That's really hard, and you can keep blocking people, and and I think with the newish versions of some of these platforms, Twitter particularly, it's becomes that much harder. We did at Columbia, and on my webcast, I did several. There are tools and training. I did several webcasts with PEN America, which is a writers organization that started providing their services to scientists too, essentially how to mitigate abuse online if you're going to be online. And this gets to that reality that this is not for everybody, but for those who. But if we all abandon these platforms, then the worst of us will love it, because again, the algorithms are designed to either validate you or piss you off, so you get a flow of stuff that takes you down. The whole idea of scrolling is design. It's a design feature. It's a design feature with no bottom. You scroll forever, and the platforms are made to do that. So,
speaking of tools and tactics, some people have asked about how to avoid being doxxed in a service, which Elisabeth answered in the chat, which is a service called Delete Me. And I want to encourage people to raise your hand if you have a question, you want to get engaged with this conversation and ask some questions or make some comments, and or you can put a question in the Q&A. Either way, raise your hand, something in the Q&A, use the chat. We'll take all comers. But so Andy was just talking about the obligation to do it, because otherwise it's just a place that will become completely, as I guess a term that's used sometimes about Twitter these days, a hellscape. But so what are some examples where you feel like you were effective in communicating science, or in moving a conversation, or in helping someone learn something that they needed to know? Where, if you've got to deal with all this anxiety and unhappiness, what's the upside? Just from an emotional side, never mind your responsibility, but also where hey, I'm doing what I wanted to do here.
Yeah, I've mentioned a few times how most of my audience primarily is parents or mothers in particular. And what I've learned from my background and from being a mother myself is that most parents, their primary goal is to keep their children safe. And that's like this innate instinct that they have. So when people on social media or in the news or wherever people are hearing this information are saying that vaccines are dangerous, that they're going to harm your kids, that they're not safe, a lot of individuals, if they don't have access to information that counters that, are going to be like, okay, I'm just not going to take this risk. If there's this risk, it's going to hurt my kid. My job is to keep them safe, and I'm not going to do it. So really early in the really beginning days of the pandemic, when vaccine rollout was just starting, most of the conversations I was having with individuals, and some of this was in comment sections, some of this was private over DMs. I also ended up opening up Zoom sessions for people if they wanted to talk to me face-to-face about their concerns with vaccines. Most of these were parents who really just wanted the ability to access science information that they could understand, because unfortunately in America's healthcare system, doctors don't have time to really sit down for an hour or a half hour with parents and explain to them, like, this is how a vaccine works. This is exactly what's in the vaccine. This is what's going to happen in your kid's immune system when they're vaccinated. This is how it compares to the infection itself. It would be great if they did have the time, and it's not their fault. It's the system that does not support that. And I have had countless of individuals who I have been able to help them feel safe enough to vaccinate their kids. But I've also had people who've decided not to for whatever reason. And at the end of the day, my goal is to give them access to information that they can understand, knowing that maybe they'll use that information differently than I would, but at least I've tried. My one motivating factor is I don't want somebody making a decision based on misinformation, especially when the decision could really impact their health negatively. So I want to try to get that information out to the parents and to the people making these decisions, and then what they do with that information is ultimately up to them.
Was sticking with you for a minute, do you go looking for fights? Lisa, maybe we could show a couple of one or two of images of some of Liz's posts, but how do you choose what you decide to blog on or post on and to getting, to get engaged with?
Yeah, so a lot of what I tackle is based on either questions that I'm getting, and either that's over a question box in my stories or based on questions I'm getting in my DMs, or it's based on things that I'm seeing in other places. So I do have a Twitter account. I don't really do science communication on Twitter, but I use it as a way of monitoring the things that are being said. I use Facebook. I grew up in a family that's anti-vax, and a lot of my family are still anti-vax, so I get to see the things that they're sharing, and that gives me an idea of the things that are being spread in those communities, and then I try to address those things as early as possible before they spread as much as they do, because unfortunately misinformation spreads a lot faster on social media than accurate information does, which is a real big problem.
So when we look at this one in particular, the kid's trial size was not too small. What was going on there?
Yes, so this was back. So anytime vaccinating adults is controversial enough, unfortunately, which I never thought it would be quite as bad as it is now. But anytime you bring kids into it, it's like 100,000 times worse. And this was really in the early days when the vaccine had just been approved for the under 18 cohort. And they were still working on getting trial data for children younger than 12. That took a while. And a big thing that was being spread was that, oh, the trial sizes are only 2,000 kids. That's not enough. And my friend, this is one of the examples of the post that I did with my friend Sabina, who does, her account is Unambiguous Science. And she and I really wanted to address this because most people don't realize how clinical trials are run. Now, before the pandemic, nobody really cared, right? Nobody was watching these CDC meetings in real time. Some people might have been, but overall not as many as are nowadays. So people didn't realize how this is how it always happens. So vaccines are always first tested in adults, in large populations of adults. And then if the vaccine shows to be safe and effective in adults, they do what we call step down trials. And those are always going to be smaller cohorts. That's just how we do all medication trials, vaccines, medications, anything for kids is done by that process. So we wanted to try to help address that issue because most people just don't realize that. So people are saying, oh, the trial size is not big enough, not realizing that this is how every single medication their kid has ever taken was also approved through the same type of process.
So some real basic instruction, basically, in so some of the principles of doing science and doing trials. And do you feel like this was successful, that people did learn? And I see your post said something like comments have been limited or something like that. Did you get some clapback that you got sick of and decided to try to control the stream a little, or?
I always do on posts related to kids specifically, but I actually, as a way of trying to mitigate trolls, I only allow comments from people who follow me. So the person who screenshotted this probably wasn't logged into their Instagram account or didn't follow me, and that is what shows up. So, and
That was
I get a lot of
me.
pushback. Yeah, I get a lot of pushback on this too from people who like to go after me, and they're saying, if you trust what you're saying is real, why are you limiting comments? And my response to them is, if you want to have a dialogue with me, all you have to do is hit follow. And then you get to see the whole types of things that I cover, not just this one post that maybe is being shared more. And you could follow me, comment, and then unfollow me right away if you really wanted to. But that was otherwise the people were able to comment normally. I just limited it to people who follow me.
I think that must have been me in this case. Andy, do you have, so now I'm surprised that I didn't actually follow you. I haven't been a big Instagram user. Now you've given me cause. Andy, do you have an example of something that you've posted that you feel was really important or really successful? You know, the inverse of a Rush Limbaugh
Yeah.
experience.
Oh, yeah.
And that you could maybe just describe for us a little bit about why you felt it was important and why
Yeah.
you felt maybe it did something successful.
Sure. If you guys unshare screen, I can show you a couple things. Some of my experience is a little anomalous because I'm a journalist, right? So I was at the New York Times, so a lot of people pay attention to me. 10 or so, maybe 12 years ago, on Twitter, I got into a bit of a spat with Mark Ruffalo, the Hulk, you know, when he was mainly known for the Hulk, and he went after me because I was being a little nuanced about fracking and gas, and then, but you could see and on Twitter we had an engagement that ended up with some constructive ideas, and I ended up writing about it, and I ended up meeting up with him on the street in New York, and I interviewed him and put that on YouTube, and so what could have been a fractious, really, you go your way, I go mine moment became an opportunity. But I want to just show you, this is something that you just heard from Elisabeth too. One of my favorite users of social media, she's having a hard time these days with her health, is Jacqueline Gill, who's at the University of Maine. And of course, I'm just showing you the wrong screen. So let me, she, all the time, she has found ways to take a moment. In this case, this is a blog post I did, enough about Elon. Here's how you can own Twitter. And I did this way back in May of last year, even just when the rumors were coming out, and I've revised it and updated it, but it's the same thing. One of the things it is an engagement pathway. So here, it's just, hopefully if people can't see this, they can review it later when it's posted online. Jacqueline tweeted, as I was getting out of my car today, I noticed a small yellow lump of pollen on the windshield, like left by a flower that fell from a tree, but which tree? Well, I happen to identify pollen. Her job, she's a paleoecologist, so she works with pollen. She took a picture of it, and she did a Twitter thread, you know, saying, here's the pollen. Here she is in the lab, just taking a quick diversion from her day-to-day work. And onward she went with a fantastic post that pulled people into her work about paleoecology, and also, you know, just got, and anyone can do that. So it's the find the opportunity, find the moment, build on it. It's a blind spot and a bias detector. I found some of my favorite sources one day when I tweeted that it seemed that many futurists out there, people who you tune into on social media or YouTube, who talk about the future, they're mostly guys, right? They're mostly people like Steven Pinker, you know, endowed academics who are men. And so I posted about this, and it's oh, has anyone done a cross analysis sifting for whether female futurists have different sense of the future than male futurists? And I got some immediately great feedback. Some of it was prickly, but it was great. It was Amy Zellman at Georgetown University, Anab Jain, a co-founder of a design firm and a consultancy, Susan Cox Smith, who I ended up having on my show because I never would have found her otherwise. Katindi Sivi Njanjo, who's a Kenyan, she's a Kenyan futurist and consultant who's building a school for getting young African kids to think better about analyzing the future. And all that came through engagement on that platform that can be a pile of crap if you want to find the garbage, whether on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or TV, you can find it. But if you go in there with a constructive mindset, and whether you're a researcher or a professional at an institution or a person wanting to answer some question important to your community, an active approach really gets around all that stuff. And it also gets around those algorithms that are there to hijack you.
So that just looking at that, it must take some time. Are you guys both self-taught, basically, in manipulating the computer environments and making such a nice looking feed like that, or your graphic style? Elisabeth, are there platforms that you use to help you, or software systems that help you do that kind of engaging content creation, or are you just complete autodidacts and do-it-yourselfers?
I use Canva for most of my Instagram posts after having tried a few other things that just did not work as well. They were taking too much of my time. So Canva works because, at least for me, I do all of my science communication is on my own time. It's not part of my paid work. It's separate from my actual real paying job. So I have limited time and I want it to be as seamless as possible. So I use Canva because it has some templates that makes it easier. And again, that goes back to building networks. So because I have now a whole group of science communicators that I talk with frequently, we get to share those types of information. So if somebody's trying something new, they get to share whether it worked or whether it didn't. I like to use BioRender if I'm doing any type of science visual to go along with my posts. And those are typically what I use the most, is Canva or BioRender to do illustrations.
I'm more self-taught. I grew up, with PowerPoint, and I actually use PowerPoint to stick images in, and I've tried Canva. I just haven't had enough time to get really comfortable with it. But on a PowerPoint, slide, you can do a lot of real cool things. I'll just show you. This is totally random. I'll just show you just for fun. For those who are not planning to learn a new platform, oh, maybe not. It'll just take me too long to find something ideal to show you. But those images you showed earlier, or maybe they're in your little deck, the monster diagrams.
So sure, Lisa, do you bring up those images that Andy made? Here we go. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's all public domain, ancient. That's a painting by the Spanish master and ancient illustration.
Oh yeah.
And I just go ahead. Although it turns out in researching it, to be sure I had the right to use it. It looks like it was actually done by his assistant. Isn't that interesting? At any rate, there's a big image, and my point there was with issues like deploying renewable energy technology or spreading conservation efforts in developing countries, a lot of deforestation. Scale is a big issue. The scale monster and the complexity monster is a multi-headed thing. The climate is a classic example of a incredibly complex problem with many, many different dimensions. And so these are ways for me to just sort of play around with ideas and capture an eyeball that might be too zoned out to words.
I think the idea of using the Hydra, we just got one comment, is something that's very familiar to some of our scientists who do a lot of work around regeneration of, say, heads. Liz and Andy, why is this world so fraught? Why are the issues that you both are so deeply engaged with, climate change and global health, and Elisabeth with vaccines and biomedical facts and the pandemic, why are these types of issues the ones that attract the most attention, as well as the most vitriol and the most sense of responsibility by people like yourselves to make a stand, a public stand on these things? What is it about them?
So anti-vaxxers have been around for centuries, and I actually have a fun photo I'm going to actually pull up. I gave a keynote at a conference last May, and I found this image when I was preparing for that. This was from back, can you guys see this? This was back from when the smallpox vaccine, which was the first vaccine developed, this was from when it was starting to be rolled out. And you can see that this was essentially the anti-vax propaganda from that time period, where they had a snake that represented the vaccination, and that was coming for their children. And then it says, "Doctor, do not vaccinate." So this is not a new problem. This has been something that's been around for centuries, but I honestly think social media has made it worse, along with the fact that some of these science topics have become politicized when they're not supposed to be. So ultimately, it should not matter what political affiliation people have or anything like that. It is what it is in terms of science. But unfortunately, there's been this whole polarization of science beyond what it really is supposed to be. And I feel like some of that has always existed, but now that social media can spread so easily, these types of things, before the advent of the internet, when these things would be like pinned around town, right? Which would be a little bit harder for people to see. But now you can just click one button, and all of a sudden people across the world are getting access to this type of information.
Yeah. It's the worst possible situation in the context of the other element I'll throw in here is that most of these arenas, including the early days of the pandemic, including how high sea levels will rise, including is CRISPR a good or bad technology? Is AI good or bad? They are all infused with uncertainty and complexity. And that's one that people react differently to that condition. But the problem is that when there's gray, you can find your narrative in the gray. And when you're passionately activated, as has happened with factions in these arenas, then you can find and harden your argument amid the uncertainty. Science, there's no single study that clarified the value of vaccines in the COVID pandemic or masking. And there's many other complexities to those questions, even now, 3.5 years in. So it's really easy to build your argument. And there's a bunch of science, of behavioral science, that has shown the when an issue gets contested and is consequential, unfortunately, there are aspects of how we react to it that aren't subject to more information. In other words, you can't convince someone out of a vaccine stance on either end. There are people I know who are hyper over focused on masking still, there's this question of the secondary mortality and from the shutdown of the hospital systems and the like. These are not simple questions, but you can basically find yourself in all that stuff. And then when you combine that with social media, which is a distillation and a crystallization, hyper crystallization, it gets bad.
Do you see similar swings?
Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Andy, please.
Well, I was just going to say that same body of psychological work, though, shows that if you come at these questions from a different angle, if you don't try to hammer somebody, it's a climate crisis, you idiot. Then you can find common ground with almost everybody, because in the end, we are all human beings. Not everybody, the ends of the curves. There are people you just have to block or avoid or report, but for the vast majority of people, you can find a route past the polarization, but you have to look for it. And it involves a lot of listening and waiting and not clicking and reacting, which is what the algorithm wants you to do. And just pause and say, well, and I can point to some great examples of how that works. I just put in a post there that people could read if they have more time. It's on this transition in my own reporting from just reporting about climate change as a like biogeophysical problem to reporting about the behavioral realities too. A friend of mine, John Sutter, Suttr, he was at CNN in 2015. He went to the most skeptical county in America on global warming, Woodward County, Oklahoma. And he just interviewed people about stuff. You know, what do you do? Where are you from? What do you believe in? You know, and he interviews this a guy who works at an oil company. He's in the oil patch. And John's from Oklahoma originally, which made it easier for him to connect, perhaps. But the guy says, he basically explained he's evangelical. He's a creationist. He actually paid for the town to have a playground with people and dinosaurs all hanging out together. So he's a hardcore creationist, right? 6,000-year-old Earth. And then he started talking about his energy system. He had half of the house covered in solar panels, half of the roof, and he was going to do the whole house because he wants to get off the grid entirely. And it's on YouTube, or I could point. I think it might be in LinkedIn that posted it. And you just pause and think, okay, so do you go into that Woodward County, Oklahoma, with a big sign saying climate emergency? Do you sit on the pavement and throw soup at the paintings? Or do you maybe say, wow, this is interesting. You have solar panels in your house. So do I, or I sure would like to, but they're really expensive. And you can have a really great conversation about how to spread access to that technology. His reasoning is the same reasoning he would never vote for a Democrat. He would never have voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But it's because he's libertarian. He doesn't want to be beholden to a utility or the government. But you would never know any of that if you rolled in there just saying, I care about global warming, so you need to care about it too.
Do you find that the left side of the spectrum in the climate question is just as susceptible to, similarly with the ultra maskers from the pandemic, that's you need to also figure out ways to communicate with evangelists of climate change?
There are a number of climate scientists, Jacqueline Gill, again, who, if you go back through their feeds, you'll see they're more abused by those who are too worried about global warming than they are about dismissives. And it's harmful, dangerous kinds of extremism on the left of this issue. Yes, Roger, and some of it's been fueled by people who really, are almost cult-like. Roger Hallam over in England, whose early communication created the Extinction Rebellion, is really using cultish tactics. I've called them out many times on social media, and so it's on all sides of these issues. You can get that kind of zeal.
Yeah, I see the same thing in the COVID realm as well. Sometimes I have myself and my friends have even gotten attacked by the zero COVID individuals who essentially want everything still locked down, and that's not sustainable for lots of reasons either. So there has to be a balance. But I also see the extremes kind of on both ends of the spectrum.
Sure. Liz, where will you take things? Do you feel like the anxiety and the pressure around the pandemic and around doing things just right is abating at all? Where will you take your mission as a science communicator in the online world as hopefully the pandemic becomes a less compelling part of our daily lives?
Yeah, I've already kind of have tried to start transitioning a little bit into more general science communication, because I think that there's one of the perspectives I take is that part of my paid job is to teach undergraduates science, and I teach a variety of science courses. And the reality is most people are never going to enter my classroom, but there's still really important science information that they could use to make important decisions. And I, as a parent, when I have come across decisions with my kids or around a few health issues that we've had when my son was first born, I've often thought about how my science background really enabled me to be able to make better informed decisions. And so now I'm moving more towards wanting to help enable the general public to have access to this kind of science information that they can understand, knowing that most of them are not going to ever enter a formal science classroom at this stage of their lives, but they still deserve access to science information that they can understand. You're muted again.
Yes, I understand. And Andy, I'm curious with you, climate is less episodic an issue, at least the long-term story than pandemics are. Where else do you see these kinds of issues arising? I mean,
Sure.
that are in the realm of science, I guess, or in the realm of describing reality as it really is. Does AI pose a new front? Where do you see, and Liz, you too, I mean, where do you see the emerging points of social media conflict might be?
They're everywhere in the sense that we live in a technological world. And one thing that I think people would benefit from is understanding that no one has the answer. So again, I mentioned CRISPR and AI earlier. There are super smart people all over these issues with very divergent views, even on climate. Jim Hansen, great climate scientist who first called out the warning on this in my first article in 1988 and much earlier. He thinks that the solution is nuclear power. He thinks that renewable solar and wind can't possibly get to scale. The scale monster will kill them. And Bill McKibben, who's been at this forever, a friend of mine from back in the day, he rejects nuclear power, and they've actually chained themselves to the same fences sometimes. They're both so adamant about fighting global warming. So don't think about this as a us and them issue when at every layer of the onion there's divergence. And so the traits that going forward, as AI picks up, AI will be taking people's jobs. It is now, not even super AI. Globalization is taking people's jobs because of technology. Someone in Bangalore is doing work that used to be done in Ohio. And so all these layers of impacts and the uncertainty that comes with thinking about the future guarantee that unless we find ways to propagate practices, both in how we communicate and how we absorb information, then I think we're facing a time of a lot of turmoil. It's not the first time. I remember there was a woman at Harvard, I don't remember her name, who wrote a paper maybe 7 or 8 years ago on the long history of information overload. And it goes back to the Gutenberg, that there were people writing about information overload over and over and over again through time. And so I guess what I'm saying is get comfortable with the reality that not just in your community, but globally, there can be deep divergence and on issues where there is no simple right and wrong, and where these media, these devices, as they're currently designed, if you're not aware that it's trying to take you, it's really working hard to take you to the wrong part of you. That doesn't mean turn it off. It just means taking a breath and thinking about it in a new way. I really, I'm going to show a slide here. I gave a talk about this the other day, and I think maybe this might help. I think you can see it. Clarify what you care about. On the solution side, whether you're a scientist or person in public life, pick a role and a goal that fits your skills and your identify biases, including your own. Pause before you click for sure. Filter for what matters. There's a guy, just as Elisabeth was saying, early in the pandemic, there was a character, a really smart guy at Columbia. He runs the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And I had him on my show talking about COVID pandemic information. And he said they are always giving advice. He gives advice to people in, leadership roles. And a big chunk of what he says is when there's an emergency, we're all like shoveling information in just when we need to be not doing that. Making sure you understand, is this useful to me? Or is it just entertaining me? Or is it just titillating me? Start with what's useful. And it's Jeff Schlegel-Milch, a really hard name for you to Google for, but I can send the video clip to anyone. He started, just like Elisabeth said, he started on Facebook. It was something he had said on Facebook along those lines that I then picked up on, did a webcast on, and got him to talk more about. But thinking, what's useful? Don't be abused. Use these things for your purpose, which can be to find common ground with people. You can do it. It's way easier, over a counter or at a bar than it is. But it's doable. I've seen it happen on my webcast because it's not scripted. It's not people having to defend a point of view. It's not a debate.
Andy, that was a great pedagogy. I'd love it if you could post that so we could all, I want to print it up and put it on my wall.
Sure.
Behind my computer. Jerry,
Right.
You had a question or something to add here?
Yeah,
And I want to encourage the rest of our audience to join in if as we wind down here. If you've got some stuff that you really want to ask, now's your chance to put up your hand. But please, Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first, I could listen to you guys for another hour. So I just want to tell you how much I appreciate not only your being here with us tonight, but just the work that you're doing. It strikes me as, number one, how brave you both are. And number two, how valuable your voice is and how much we need to hear that voice, your voices. And it just strikes me, a couple of things. Andy, I also love that last slide that you just posted, because I think those reminders are so important to all of us. And one of the things that I'm really curious about, and Liz, I've seen you post about this, is sort of tools and techniques to find that common ground, right? Because I think we all need those skills. We all need to be intentional about those things. And it can be hard, particularly when it's a really emotional issue. You care passionately about things and whatever. But I'm just curious about that. If there are resources that you find helpful or have found to help you along in that journey.
I know personally, I think one of the things that I try to practice a lot is something called compassionate communication. And that kind of goes back to what Andy was saying before, where you try to find common ground. And for me, a lot of times that common ground is the fact that I'm also a parent. So I can relate to that desire that all parents have to keep their kids safe. So even if I don't agree with a decision that somebody's making personally, I can understand that the reason that they're making this decision is because they feel it's the best to keep themselves and their family safe. And that, if you can remind yourself of those things that we all have in common, because at the end of the day, most of us, at least in the area where vaccines and that type of science are concerned, most of us want to keep ourselves safe. And we want to keep the people we care about safe. And if we can remember that, finding that common ground and realizing that sometimes what's motivating people is that desire, and they just don't have the same access to the information you do, or they might be making a different decision based on that same information. And then at the end of the day, they're entitled to make that decision, even if you don't agree with it. I do have a link that I will post into the chat into an article I wrote about communicating with friends and family about these topics. I just have to find it. It'll take me a second. But Andy might have things to add.
Well, I did also put in the chat, in March 12th, 2020, I launched this webcast I call Sustain What, which is an interrogatory conversation around what was first mostly about the pandemic and then back to the other issues I deal with, disaster risk reduction, information, climate, et cetera. And I quickly, it became clear that one track of these was what I call thriving online. So if people go to that link I put in there, you'll see dozens and dozens of conversations about how to thrive online, despite all. And it's really a cornucopia. I should organize it more into a clean sequence of Twitter, Wikipedia, et cetera, et cetera. But it's kind of an online curriculum I started to build and still am. One thing I do think it's really vital to understand is this is an emergent system that you're not done. So finding a way to use it, not be abused by it, to create a time space for that, so it doesn't consume you, and to understand it'll be different next week. AI is the new monster, which is an amazing tool already. I've been using it, but I had on the poet Andrei Codrescu was on my show, and some of you probably remember him from NPR commentary. And on live on our webcast, we put in the chatbot. I said, write a poem in the style of Andrei Codrescu, with Andrei Codrescu right there. And it did, and it was hilarious. He's kind of critiquing it while I was doing it. And who knows where that's going to go. I do know it'll go to the worst of us if first, Russia and China are probably have their own chatbot 45s already. Being prepared for that, there are serious issues ahead with deep fakery and the like, finding ways to mitigate the chances of it starting a nuclear war. That would be a very good thing to do. But for us, the day-to-day basis, it's more, I think it's actually, you'll find ways to make these tools useful but you have to be attuned to the reality that you're not done anytime soon.
It's going to be a huge challenge, and I wonder if we're seeing yet. We have sometimes a problem with people faking science. We have some people online who are real sort of effective hall monitors around that. Is there a potential here that there's going to need to be a lot of sleuthing to see whether some science is being faked by AI? Somebody giving it a smart instruction to reach conclusions they want to see. Is that emerging yet? I can certainly imagine it.
Well, it's a cycle. I'm sure Elisabeth knows. I do think overall, having this online scrutiny is going to make science more honest in the long run. Because the retraction watch, Google for retraction watch. If you're a scientist, you don't want to be in retraction watch, right? I know the guy who founded it, and he's brilliant. And that whole so the danger is that someone comes out with a new study. We have this sort of single study syndrome I talk about in the newsroom. Oh my God, look at this. It's really cool science. We give it a lot of attention before it's been fully baked. And that can lead to reader whiplash. Sorry, but Elisabeth.
I was just going to say that as a professor, I have been playing around with this chat GPT because I'm wondering how much can my students use this to cheat their way through my microbiology class. And my husband and I were playing with it, and we asked them to write an essay on germ granules, which was one of the things that I studied when I was at the biolab with Dustin Updike, and I still work on. And it wrote an essay on it, but it faked references, which was the one key giveaway. But if somebody had actually gone through and replaced it with real references, it probably would have been a C paper, which is not terrible, right? Which is kind of scary. And it just passed the US state medical licensing exam. That was news on something I was reading this past week. I do want to pause for 1 second. Sarah asked a question a while ago, and I wanted to just address that quickly. She asked if we tend to engage with misinformation posts, or is it just too much to push back against, and the better strategy is to just put the good information out there? And I do not engage with posts that are by other people that are disinformation or misinformation. And I don't, because by engaging with that, you're actually helping the algorithm spread that information more. So it's really better if you see information that's not true. It's better to either private message that person personally if you're friends with them and provide information if that's what you wanted to do with a comment, or instead share accurate information instead of engaging with that disinformation. Otherwise, it just helps the algorithm spread that information more. And that's why misinformation spreads much more quickly than anything that's trying to counteract that misinformation.
By the way, I just put a link in here. Jay Rosen, who's a journalism professor at NYU, many years ago wrote about what he calls a truth sandwich. It's a structural way to deal with. Well, it was for him. It was how did the media deal with Donald Trump, who was a fountain of untruths. And he said, start with the truth, then explain, put in the news about the thing that's not true, and then end with the truth. And
I try to practice this often when I'm engaging. And I'm going to share another paper too in the chat. It's actually some psychological research has shown that instead of debunking, what actually is better is pre-bunking, which is where if you know that, like, we know that AI stuff is going to take over, and we know that gene editing with CRISPR in humans is coming. So a better strategy is to get ahead of that type of issue and start informing the public about these issues and warning them that this information is coming so that they're more prepared to deal with the misinformation that comes as a result of that. So we call that like the inoculation theory. But I'm going to link a paper that was really done well about that.
Yeah.
And Andy, you've mentioned a few times your show. Have you put up a link to that as well for people who?
I'll put up the direct link. Yeah, I put in a sort of a link tree thing that goes to all of my stuff. But here's the show is called Sustain What. If you anyone out there, just Google for the phrase Sustain What and the name Revkin. There's a link to the homepage.
Sustain What Live. I see. Okay.
You'll find these shows, which I try to do at least once a week. Early parts of the pandemic, I was doing 3 a week, and I've done 400 of them and learned a lot through those conversations.
So it does seem pretty clear that we could continue this for an hour, and we're just really getting rolling once we brought AI into the conversation. And I think that clearly that's going to need to be a continuing conversation. I can't thank you guys enough. I shared Jerry's admiration and gratitude for the work that you guys do, and really feel honored that you were able to join us today. Is there any last thing that anybody, we're already past our hour, but is anybody still hanging in there and looking for a particular line of inquiry that they wanted to address? We'd love to hear it. You can contact me after this for more information or for any help accessing some of the information that came up today. Maybe, Liesl, if you could show my card screen, which basically I'm fbever at mdibl.org, and I can try to help you get to the places that you want to be.
That's great. Fred, I just wanted to chime in and say, there were so many great links that were shared in the chat today. So we are going to try to pass some of those on to you and some of the follow-up emails that we'll send out, just because really valuable resources that we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to take advantage of. And so just to let you know that.
Oh, any last words from our guests that you want to be sure to get in, or where I'm sitting, it looks like Andy's frozen, but we made it through this whole event without that.
Yeah, I froze. I'm back. Although as of next Monday, I think I'll be on a hard line here in Lemoyne, Maine, with like the last road on the last peninsula in Maine. That's and I want to be sure everyone understands I'm in Maine now, even though I still work at Columbia, and I can come to the lab. We can do more on this anytime.
Bob Morris, did you have something you wanted to chime in on here? I'm trying to unmute you.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you both. This was great. My main question was, how do I do this and not get overwhelmed? And I feel like you've given me some good tools to make some steps that I was always wanting to take, but always nervous about taking. So thank you very much for that.
Well, and I want to jump in on that, and I know we're over our time, and I apologize, but Liz, it strikes me we spend so much time talking about science communication with the students that are here at the lab, and I would love to think a little bit more about working with you both on what are those sort of skills that we can share with students, because it feels like a really dynamic environment right now, right? What we were teaching even 2 years ago is no longer exactly, it's changing, and emphasis changes, and all of those things. So to me, getting a cadre of people, a group of people who are willing to sort of step out there a little bit, maybe, or as Andy said, find what really matters to you, find what you're good at, and sort of, speak from that place. And I think that's such an important message. I just want to emphasize that.
And
And
the only
that's-
thing, sorry, the only thing
that's-
I would add is that it doesn't have to be about followers, right? Like, I started doing this because I wanted to reach my friends and family. And honestly, that's enough. Even if you never have a bunch of followers, communicating science to your friends and family and to your local community will make a difference. So I am very passionate about helping other people also get better at communicating science, because I can only reach so many myself, but the more people doing it, the better.
Fantastic.
And I think
it's,
Andy's frozen again.
yeah, I thought we had another Bobby Lamont, but I think we lost her. So I'll just harken back to something Andy mentioned at the beginning, which was talking about the interest in sea level change around MDI. Our next MDI Science Cafe will be looking at the question of sea level change in our local environment, MDI, with a project that originates out of the Episodic Institute, and some wonderful scientists and historians and artists working with them around that subject. And
Great.
we had a slide around that, but it's maybe not. There we go. Here we go. Here are the slides. Landscape of Change. So that's on May 8th.
I'm going to come to that one.
Great. We'll be glad to see you there. I know you've done some work before with Episodic, so that's a natural. So thank you, everyone, so much. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for
Really
having me
good.
as well.
See you guys
This
out
is-
there in the real world sometime soon, I hope.